Unit 3. Tracing the evolution of the concept of culture in connection with second language teaching method from the 80th until the mid-20th century. Before we move on the content of the Unit 3, let's review what we have learned from the previous unit. We have learned that the contemporary object-oriented understanding of culture has a societal, historicist, national, and artistic dimensions. Also, it is associated with geography and history, and with a traveler's perspective. This conception of culture emerged in the 18th, 19th century under the influence of many factors, such as the emergence of historical thinking, the development of national consciousness and national education, and massive exploratory and educational traveling abroad. Let's review once again the most important features of this understanding of culture which influenced the second language education. First, culture closely associated with language was considered as a manifestation of a national spirit, Volksgeist, and an important agent of national education. Also, in understanding of culture, an artistic, aesthetic dimension often came to front. The representation of culture was often influenced by literature-centrism and a la philologia perspective, association between language and literary studies, because language and literature were considered as the most salient manifestations of the national spirit. Also, culture was often viewed as an association between literature and other important characteristics of a nation, such as history and geography. Initially, systematic teaching of culture was not a name of second language classes and textbooks. It was travel writing, which provided information on foreign culture by presenting it from a traveler's perspective. The interest in other cultures was often manifest as the interest in realia, object-oriented information on real-life culture in other countries, including travel realia and conversational realia. In the current unit, we will see how these features were integrated into second language methodology of the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically into the grammar translation method and the direct method. Before moving on the methods, we must clarify one important thing about how we understand the evolution of methodology in second language education. The history of second language education knows many different approaches and methods. In their famous book, Approaches and Methods in Language Teaching, Jack Richards and Theodore Rogers quoted more than 20 of them, and this list is far from complete. The manner in which the methods are presented in the literature and second language teachers' minds is often grounded in an idea of permanent progression. We tend to believe that more progressive and efficient methods come to replace the less efficient one. And if one teaching method is not popular anymore, that is because its non-efficiency has been proven. However, this is a rather wrong way of thinking. In second language education, there is an apparent lack of empirical research aimed at comparing the efficiency of different methods and approaches in naturalistic settings of second language classrooms. If it is not comparative research, what does make us change methods? Usually, second language educators' communities switch to a new method because this method responds better to the social demand and our beliefs on how languages should be taught and learned, rather than because it has demonstrated more efficient results. The emergence of new second language teaching methods is usually inspired by new theoretical ideas from educational psychology or applied linguistics, or simply by a new trend in educational policy. That is why it happens very often that the general principles and teaching techniques of the methods we consider obsolete simply return under new names. So, speaking about a specific method dominating in one particular period in the past, we do not mean that this method doesn't have a pedagogical value today. Culture in the grammar translation method. Many researchers agree that the grammar translation method, Grammatikübersetzung-Methode per se, has never existed as an independent and theoretically sound approach. Richards and Rogers call it a method for which there is no theory, because there is no literature that offers rationales for it. Even the name grammar translation emerged in the end of the 19th century in the discourse of its opponents, the scholars who criticized this approach. In his famous lecture against the traditional method, the German language pedagogue Wilhelm Fjotter characterized the popular teaching practices of that time as focused on Grammatik und Übersetzung. Since that time, we have used the term grammar translation method as an umbrella term for a set of traditional teaching techniques mostly focused on the explicit teaching of grammar, reading, and translation. Ironically, even though the general attitude to the grammar translation method today is rather negative and disdainful, this method is not dead. It is still widely practiced in second language classroom, even though second language teachers do not realize it. Moreover, some teaching techniques belonging to the grammar translation method, such as translation, have been recently reviewed and justified in the light of the new trend of using activities based on contrasting first language and second language. We call this trend bilingual reform in second language education. The so-called contrastive teaching has been supported by some recent cognitive and neurocognitive theories of second language acquisition. These theories explain that the human brain acquires second language by cross-linguistic interaction. In other words, by contrasting the new language system to the existing one. The successful cross-linguistic interaction depends on learners' ability to perceive differences between second language and first language. We call this ability cross-linguistic awareness. So by drawing learners' attention to the differences between second language and first language, we can help the learner's brain to do their job. Translation is a perfect means for that. The grammar translation method derives from the traditional teaching of dead languages such as ancient Greek, Latin, or Biblical Hebrew. These languages do not require the development of oral and conversational proficiency. Initially, the grammar translation method had two main goals: to enable students to read and translate literature written in the target language, and to facilitate students' general intellectual development through grammatical analysis of language structures. When applied to teaching modern languages, the grammar translation method has been completed with some techniques helping to develop oral proficiency too. The typical learning teaching strategies we can find in textbooks inspired by the grammar translation methods are usually the following. The focus on teaching grammar. The teacher or the textbook provides detailed explanation of grammar rules. However, there is no consensus on the way to introduce grammar. It can be presented as comments to a text, in which case notes on grammar accompany the reading, or as a special units entirely devoted to grammar. These units may precede or following the reading and translation. Memorization of separate vocabulary presented as a list is the second common technique in the grammar translation method. The next one, reading aloud and analyzing text, often literary text, with an interlinear translation in first language. Texts are treated as exercises in grammatical analysis, and their cultural content is usually out of scope. The next technique is making translation based on grammar rules and vocabulary learned separately. And finally, memorizing bilingual dialogues, referring to everyday polite communication. We call these techniques conversational realia. How is the culture integrated into the grammar translation method? As we can see, teaching second culture per se is not central to the grammar translation method. Many textbooks in the 18th, 19th centuries contain very little or no culture-related components, like, for example, the famous Praktische Französische Grammatik by Johann Valentin Meindiger, published in Germany in 1783. This textbook ran to some 38 editions and spawned many imitations. Let's have a closer look at the structure of this book. After explaining a piece of grammar and presenting a vocabulary list to be learned by heart, the textbook suggests practicing the target language by translating given sentences from German into French. At the end of the book, we can find a collection of anecdote-like one-paragraph stories aus erlesene Historien, suggested to practice reading in French. These short texts are culture-related but not culture-specific. Among the main characters of these stories, we can find François Rabelais, along with a tailor from Samarkand, a certain minister, a certain king, a Frenchman speaking with a German man, a certain farmer, and so on. Some of these texts may express some cultural stereotypes, but they do not aim to present and explain French culture. This single culture-related section in this book is the one that explains how to use French titles, Madame, Monsieur, in different kinds of letters. However, many other textbooks inspired by the grammar translation method do contain cultural components. If it's the case, how can these components be integrated into a textbook? There are at least three ways to do that. First, it is the case when a textbook is focused on learning languages through reading authentic literary masterpieces. We call this approach literature-centrism. Learning a second language happens through reading, translating, and analyzing literary texts. The content of this text and its cultural meaning per se are usually not the object of teaching and learning. However, learners are exposed to the target culture through simple contact with this text. The second way, it is the case when, instead of literary works, or beside them, a textbook suggests reading text on the history and geography related to the country where the target language is spoken. This way to integrate culture refers to the understanding of culture as an interdisciplinary cluster composed of literature, history, and geography. Finally, a textbook may suggest memorizing dialogues, referring to polite everyday conversations. The target culture is presented thus in the form of spontaneously conversational realia. Let's see some examples. The Italian textbook by Giuseppe Baretti an introduction to the Italian language, published in 1755, provides a lovely illustration of literature-centrism. The textbook suggests progressing in Italian by reading, I quote, specimens both of prose and verse written by famous Italian authors. These specimens are accompanied with a literal translation and grammatical notes. To complete this textbook, 20 years later, the same author published another one focused on conversational skills. Easy phraseology for the use of young ladies who intend to learn the colloquial part of the Italian language. The textbook contains a collection of dialogue with an interlinear translation in English. The characters of the dialogues converse on many topics related to real-life situations, such as language classroom, rice spotting, news from a newspaper, family affairs, affairs of the heart, leisure, and so on. However, the topics of the dialogues are not announced in their titles, so the thematic content of the conversation is not considered important enough to define the book's structure. This textbook provides an example of conversational realia, yet presented in a known or less systematic manner. Our next example is the textbook for German beginner learners of Russian, published in 1859 by August Bolz. From the preface of the book, we can learn that Dr. Bolz taught Russian in a military school in Berlin. This book provides an illustration of literature-centrism combined with conversational reality approach. Let's see how. At the beginning of each lesson, learners read aloud a fragment of the novel Tamang by the famous Russian writer Mikhail Lermontov. The first time, the fragment is presented with a phonetical interlinear transcription, and the second time with a word-by-word German interlinear translation. Then the text and its translation are given into two parallel columns to facilitate memorization and comparison. And finally, a German literary translation is provided. After that, the section conversation suggests questions to check the understanding of the text, including its vocabulary, with suggested answers. The questions are asked in German, students' first language, in less advanced lessons, and in Russian in more advanced lessons. Then learners move on to reading aloud and learning by heart Russian-German parallel dialogues focused on conversational realia announced by topic. For example, greetings in a park, asking about health, and so on. The following theoretical part of this lesson provides detailed comments on phonetics, vocabulary, and grammar we can find in the unit. Bolz's textbook illustrates the variation of the grammar translation method in which grammar explanations are provided not in the form of comments, but within a separate unit that follows, not precedes, the reading. This means that before studying grammar explicitly, the learner may have an opportunity to get familiar with language, structures, and vocabulary and guess their meaning by comparing texts in the target language with their German translation. Naturally, we cannot help mentioning the famous textbook series Conversation Grammar Method Gaspe Odozaur. This series has been launched and successfully continued over 6 decades by the Heidelberg publishing house Julius Gross Verlag. Julius Gross conversation grammars were extremely popular in Europe from the 1860s until the 10th. 3 second language educators have contributed to developing this method, 2 of which are also related to Heidelberg. The first was Dr. Thomas Gospe, associate professor at the University of Heidelberg and director of a private school for boys in Heidelberg. He published English conversation grammar. The second was Emil Otto, lecturer of modern languages at the University of Heidelberg and the author of French and German conversation grammars. And the last one was Karl Sauer, professor of Italian, the author of Italian and Spanish conversation grammars. All textbooks published under the title Method Gospe Otto Sauer had a similar structure based on grammar presentation, vocabulary learning, reading, and translation. As we can see, for example, in Karl Sauer's Spanish conversational grammar, published in 1880. The table of contents and structure of this book are aligned with the order in which the grammar is introduced. The first section of each lesson explains a piece of grammar. Then the learner must memorize a list of words. The vocabulary memorization is followed by reading simple sentences and then translating similar sentences from the student's mother tongue to the target language. And finally, a conversation section suggests a rather artificial dialogue based on the sentences learned in previous sections. At the end of the book, we can find a collection of poems and prose related, but not always, to Spanish culture. For example, in addition to a fragment coming from the pen of the famous Spanish writer Cervantes, we can find a text about French customs and the origin of the European carnival. In more advanced lessons, translation units become bigger and more sophisticated. However, they still contain non-related between each other sentences referring to different kind of narratives, including historical one. For example, within the same exercise, learners are suggested to translate sentences such as "the soul of the man," says Goethe, "resembles to the water," "the Cid is one of the greatest heroes of Spain," "boys play with kites." Reading units in more advanced lessons integrate Spanish culture in more consistent way. They contain text on different events related to the history of Spain, such as Battle of Lepanto and the history of the city Valencia. At the same time, conversational units contain set of questions aiming at factual checking the content of the text, that is, the history of Spain. We can see that the method Gospe Otto Sauer illustrates the trend toward national history-oriented conception of culture. Let's summarize. The grammar translation method is not focused on teaching culture systematically. Many textbooks inspired by this method contain very little or no culture-related elements, like we saw in the famous Praktische Französische Grammatik by Johann Meindiger. However, in other books, we can find some techniques aiming at integrating culture into second language classrooms and textbooks. Learning grammar, along with reading, analyzing, and translating written texts and memorizing bilingual dialogues, are the core activities of the grammar translation method. The text to be read and memorized by heart can be irrelevant in regard to the target culture, or, on the contrary, related to it. In the last case, we can observe at least 3 possibilities. The first one is the literature-centrist approach, when learning second language happens through reading, analyzing, and translating literary text. The content of this text and its cultural meaning are usually out of the scope. However, learners are exposed to the target culture through contact with this text. We could observe this trend in the Italian textbook by Giuseppe Baretti and Russian textbook by August Bolz. The second possibility is the orientation toward text focused on history or geography. We could observe this trend in Carl Sauer's Spanish conversation grammar and other textbooks from the famous series Method Gaspe Otto Sauer. And finally, if a textbook contains real-life oriented dialogues to be read and memorized by heart, the culture is present in the form of conversational reality. We could observe this trend in Bolt's Russian textbook and the collection of Italian dialogues by Giuseppe Baretti.